To see you.
And delightful and an honor to be with you as always, Bret.
We're going to allow a few seconds to go by for the room to populate, as they say. And where am I catching you? Are you at home in Jerusalem? Where are you right now?
I'm at home in Jaffa.
Okay, lovely. I am in SAPIR's offices in New York City.
Know them.
And we are really we're really proud and pleased to publish you in the current issue. It's not the first time you have written for SAPIR, but the current issue, which I'm holding in my hand on the subject of chosenness, is, I think, my favorite, although every time we come out with a new issue, I think it's my favorite. And then we go on to the next one. So I want to begin. Your essay is A Chosen State, looking at this question of whether, if in fact the Jewish people are the chosen people, the Jewish state is the chosen state. And you begin by saying something of which I was not fully cognizant, which was the degree to which the founding Zionist fathers took the opposite view of what the state of Israel was meant to be. Far from being a chosen state, it was simply meant to be or have, as Benjamin Netanyahu wrote many years ago in a book, just have a place among the nations, be one among many nations. Take us through for a moment, if you will, the thinking of those early Zionist leaders trying to get away from this idea or maybe fact of chosenness.
Well, thank you, Bret. And I just want to say, a word about SAPIR. It's that rare journal that makes a difference, that gets people thinking, that inspires people at a time when we need to think so desperately, and we are desperately in need of inspiration. So thank you for everything you do and for your whole staff does at SAPIR. So to understand the early Zionist revolution, the rebellion against chosenness, you have to understand who these rebels were. These are people who knew what they were rebelling against. They had come out of cheder, they had come out of yeshivas. They came out of the religious world. And what did the religious world teach them? That chosenness, as it is expressed in the Torah, and by the way, it's rarely expressed in the Torah. It's in Genesis, it's in Deuteronomy, and it's in Exodus. But it's a very different concept. It's the concept that evolved over the course of 3,000 years of Jewish history. What is it? God says, you will be my chosen people, which is a poor translation of Am Skula, which actually doesn't mean chosen. It means my treasured people. You'll be my special treasure. But it's conditional. It's highly conditional. You'll be treasured as long as you keep my commandments. It's a transactional relationship between Israel and God, that chosenness. And during the rest of the Bible, the Tanakh, over the course of the next 1,000 years, chosenness almost disappears from the Jewish discourse. There's one remote reference to the book of Amos, the prophet Amos. But the children of Israel, later to be called the Jews, are just another Mediterranean people. No better, often quite worse than some of their neighbors. And the one thing that distinguishes us is our relationship with this God and his message and his commandments and his revelation. All that changes after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. And suddenly the Jews are cast into exile, and they are persecuted by the Romans, and certainly after Rome becomes Christian in the 4th century, persecuted. And then chosenness attains an entirely different meaning for Jews in our position in the universe. What does it mean? Well, the Jews take the Christian idea of Jewish homelessness, of suffering, and they turn it on the head. What do the Christians say? The Christians say the Jews don't have a homeland. They're condemned to wander, to be always persecuted because they didn't accept the revealed God, the real Lord of Jesus Christ. The Jews take that on its head and say, no, we are suffering because we're special, because we have a special relationship with God, and we have a unique mission in the world. There's a line in the Talmud that says that you only get oil out of olives by crushing those olives. So the Jews become the olives, and the oil is a chosen oil. And that really, for the next 1,800 years, is the regnant notion of chosenness for the Jews. In more modern times, certainly post-Enlightenment, that becomes sort of a mixture of tikkun olam and chosenness. So we actually have a mission in the world. It's not just to be chosen for chosenness' sake. It's chosen to bring a mission to the world. The mission of the world is to bring Jewish values, Jewish ideals, monotheism to the world, morality to the world. That's our mission. And that you see right up into the late 19th century. And then along comes these Zionists who have studied in their cheder, and they're leaving Poland, and they're leaving Lithuania, and they're coming to the land of Israel, and they're going to create something different. They don't want to be chosen. They want to be normal. They want to be a country and a nation like any other nation. They certainly don't want to suffer. The whole Zionist enterprise is an attempt to end Jewish suffering. It is that reaction to the Jewish question. It's the answer. Let's end it. Let's not be normal. Let's be everybody else and stop being normal. That is the secular Zionist. It's not the religious Zionist, not the Zionists who come out of the school of Rabbi Kook, who today we see these are the people with the knit kippot. Many of them are settlers today. And it's certainly not the Zionists of Christian Zionists, evangelical Zionists, who see Zionism very much in a similar way that religious Zionists do, as having a messianic or chiliastic role in history. It's the beginning of the Messianic Age, the creation of the State of Israel. That's why they celebrate holidays like Israel's Independence Day or Jerusalem Reunification Day as holy holidays, the religious holidays. It's God's intervention in history. But for secular Zionism, this was a rebellion against specialness, against chosenness. And as you read in this article, it's a rebellion that failed.
So first of all, to our audience, as we always do in these conversations, I try to reserve the last third, the last 20 minutes of the conversation for your questions. So at the bottom of your Zoom page, you will see something that says Q&A, and as Michael speaks and thoughts occur to you or questions occur to you, make sure to put them in that chat function, in that Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. Now, before we get closer to the present, Michael, I want to ask you to reflect, in part because you've written so masterfully about it, about what happened in 1967. Because in 1967, it seemed to me that in some ways the character of the state began to change, not only with the kind of the miracle of deliverance that was represented by the Six-Day War, but also the lands it opened up, Judea and Samaria, the historical heartland of biblical Israel. And the political nature of the state also began to change with it. To what extent did thinking about Jewish chosenness or Israeli chosenness begin to change with that date?
So before that date, I mentioned before that this rebellion, the secular Zionist rebellion against chosenness, had failed. Why? Because the state of Israel comes into being in 1948 as a largely secular state. And yet, right from the outset, in the early 1950s through the early 1960s, what does the state of Israel do? It develops all these programs for helping developing countries in the Asian subcontinent, throughout Africa. I had a close relationship with the family of Levi Eshkol, the prime minister in the mid-60s. It was full of spears and shields from African tribes. Ben Gurion, wearing a sarong. And we had this notion that we also had to be a light unto nations. So even hardwired into the Zionist experience was the ambivalence about chosenness. And that ambivalence is greatly amplified by the Six-Day War. Because on one hand, it is a messianic event. So it is viewed by religious Zionists. So it is viewed by evangelical Christians. It is the reunification of the people with Israel with the land of Israel. And what that means is at the beginning of the Messianic age. For other parts of Israeli society, it's a question, what are we, a liberal Western-style democracy, to do as occupiers and of another people who actually don't want to be under our control? We're maybe not occupying the land, but we're certainly maybe occupying the people. And there are big debates about that. And these are divisions that have grown deeper and deeper throughout Israeli history, throughout Israeli society over the course of the last 6 decades. as you know, and become an issue not just internally within Israel, but in Israel's foreign relations. And how does that impact our chosenness? Can we truly be a chosen people who most of the world views as occupiers? Now, increasingly, certainly since the war in Gaza, not just as occupiers, but people who practice apartheid, even genocide. How can we still lay claim to the label of chosenness?
The coming closer to the present, I mean, one of the um, continuous or constant laments of, I think, many Israelis and many of us who are defenders of Israel is the extent to which Israel is singled out in a way that for opprobrium, for attention, as an obsession in the media, in global politics, in a way that just simply doesn't apply to any other equivalent, relatively small state. I mean, Israel now is just about approaching the population of Sweden. For a long time, it was closer to, something like a Luxembourg or a much smaller country. The flip side, of course, of chosenness is that people have Gentiles have a set of expectations about Jewish behavior or Jewish importance or the state of Israel's importance that attaches to no other state in the same way. And how should Israelis think about that?
Well, as someone who deals with the foreign press pretty much on a daily and nightly basis, I'll tell you that 90 to 90%, 95% of the accusations against the state of Israel have a deep resonance with classic anti-Semitic tropes. To interview with the BBC, to interview with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, virtually anything that ends with BC. You will see that these people believe that everybody I know wakes up in the morning and thinks nothing more than killing Palestinians, starving Palestinians, killing Palestinian children, particularly children, because Jews kill children. Jews are vengeful people. We're not in Gaza to defend our families and our homeland. We're there to exact vengeance, because the Jewish God is a vengeance God. It's a vengeful God. And you hear these echoes over and over and over again. Now, the impulse would be to go where our Talmudic forefathers went and say, this is a sign of our chosenness. The fact that we are the targets of such abject anti-Semitism all the time just shows how special we are, how chosen we are. We're the olive oil that's being crushed out of these poor olives. And there is a certain desire on Israeli part to see us that way. Look how special we are because we're being oppressed and hated in this way. We ourselves react to this. We say, well, our army is the most moral army in the world. And when you look at the Gaza health authorities, that oxymoron, the Gaza health authorities say that 60,000 Palestinians have been killed. When you do the math and you subtract from that the number of terrorists we know we have killed, the number of Palestinians who have been killed by rockets that have fallen short, the number of Palestinians who simply died by natural causes, and the Gaza health folks add that on to the total, you get something close to a 1-to-1 combatant to non-combatant fatality ratio, which has never been equaled by any army in modern history, certainly not by the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, when it was closer to 26-to-1 combatants to civilian deaths. So we would then adduce that number and say, look how moral we are. And yet we also say, in many ways, we want to say we just want to be like a normal country. We want to be like the United States fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. So again, the ambivalence is hardwired into this. And to resist the urge to go where we were 1,700 years ago, and again adduce the anti-Semitism as proof of our specialness, is an impulse which I think we must resist.
At the same time, and you make this case, I think, very powerfully, there is indeed something very special happening in Israel. Israel is, in many ways, demonstrating what it means, and I think demonstrating to a timorous and rudderless West what it means to be a democracy that is capable of defending itself against enemies sworn to its destruction, to take the initiative in ways that constantly surprise and astonish the world, to do, as the new German Chancellor Merz said, to do the world's dirty work in dealing with Iran, something that simply would not have happened without Israeli initiative. Israel is, in fact, in my view, at any rate, and I want your thoughts on this, really serving as a light unto the nations in a time when dictatorship and totalitarianism is again on the march. To me, it reminds me of the attitude of Great Britain in May of 1940, which was willing to stand alone against what seemed to be an unstoppable Third Reich. So let's talk a little bit about this concluding section of your essay, which is about what could we be, what could Israel be, what could the Jews be, but what could Israel be doing for the world if only the world were prepared to listen? And I guess the follow-on question is, how do we make that point more explicit, more clear to a world that doesn't seem to want to listen?
Well, we are a light unto nations. Sometimes it's a harsh light that many nations don't want to see. Now, prior to October 7th, it was an easier case to make. Israel was the country that had successfully reconciled East and West, reconciled modernity with tradition, basically giving the same amount of investment, national investment, as it does to religious schools, as it does to high-tech companies and R&D. A country, as you think you intimated, that has managed to be a democracy, and one of the few countries in the world, Bret, never to know a second of non-democratic governance, and the only country on that list never to know a second of peace. It's one of our great accomplishments, but also a nation of arms. In this conflict, we've had something in the order of 400,000 Israelis leave their homes, leave their families, pick up a gun, go out to fight, knowing full well what the danger was to fight for their country. That proportionally is equivalent of about 22 million Americans, which is about 6 million Americans more than fought in all of World War II. I mean, who's picking up a gun and fighting for Belgium today, or Spain, or Italy? This is entirely unique. You have a democratic country with a population that's willing to go out and fight for it, and fight in some cases to the death. And that in itself is extraordinary. A country that has a universal healthcare system, even though we have Jews paying for Bedouin, paying for Druze for their healthcare, and very excellent healthcare. A country that is environmentally very, very conscious. We have a greater percentage of our area under conservation than any other country in the world, except for France. We're the only country that entered the 21st century with more trees than we entered the 20th century. I mean, I can go on and on with all these factoids. What makes Israel very special, a country that absorbs refugees from 70 different countries and teaches them a language and makes 7 of the world's leading universities. That's very, very special. Post October 7th, it becomes more problematic. And here we have an example of a country that is standing up to an evil, to an abject evil, an evil that negates everything that the civilization of the West, your society, and the United States, our society, cherishes. Are we doing it perfectly? Guess what? We are not. We are human beings. We have people in our army who are irresponsible at times. The government makes terrible mistakes. But the Israeli army has also faced a challenge, not just in Gaza, but generally with Lebanon, with other fronts, which has never been encountered by any other army in history, or I mean remotely in history. You can go back to Fallujah and Mosul in the Iraq War, where the U.S. military, those small group of people, went up against maybe 5,000 to 10,000 rebels in cities that had been abandoned. And you know how desperate those battles were. Israel in Gaza was facing 30,000 Hamas terrorists, hidden within a population of 2.5 million, with 500 kilometers of tunnels underneath. There's nothing remotely like it. So we're providing an example of how a country that is fighting for its survival, fighting for its freedom, fighting against this evil, can do it in the face of challenges never before encountered by any other army, with all the mistakes. That, to me, is an example of chosenness. I asked for a certain extension on the article because it was the height of the Iran war, the 12-day Iran war. I mean, here this tiny country took on a country that was about 10 times its size, with 8 sizes population, 2,300 kilometers away, and dealt it a very severe military blow without losing a single airplane. Without losing a single airplane. Is that not an example of chosenness? I don't know what is.
Let me ask you, I've had conversations in the last few days with senior Israeli journalists and former officials, and I asked them whether they were particularly preoccupied by, well, some of the battles that you're fighting on TV stations that end as BC. And what struck me is they uniformly responded that Israelis really are kind of shrugging their shoulders at the demonization of the state and of its actions outside their borders. They feel like, you know, in a sense it's a effectively feudal battle. The deck is stacked against them. The libels, you know, are too numerous to count. They're not getting a fair audience, and there's a side of me that kind of admires this attitude of just shrugging away the libel and defamation of the Jewish state. That's not, however, a luxury I have in my business, and I don't think it's one that you have in your life. How important is it for Israel to, I guess, get its act together in responding to the defamatory claims? And why has the government, in your view, been so lackadaisical in mounting a response?
You know, I sit on a lot of interministerial committees dealing with this issue. And I'm always the guy who has got the bad news as they go around the table and say, we have to do more on campus. We have to do more on social media. And I'll always say at the end, yeah. But guys, at the end of the day, we have to internalize that we are the Jewish state. And we're going to be judged by a completely different set of standards. We're going to be judged by Western standards for Jews. And that's going to be tremendously challenging. And it's true. I mentioned earlier how the anti-Semitic tropes find their way into headlines almost daily. You know, the New York Times publishing pictures of children's skulls with bullets in them, which were clearly fabricated, okay, to show that Jews kill children. It's out there. Having said all that, we have I would say, an almost sacred duty to go out there and fight. We have to fight on a purely let's say, strategic method, because when I go on to a very tough, like the BBC, when I enjoy doing the BBC, I'm sure you do too. I'm not talking. I
never accept invitations. No, because it's invariably, it always feels like a stacked deck. But I'm glad you do.
And it is. But I'm out for the maybe 5 or 15% of their viewership that hasn't made up its mind yet. And thinking to myself of the tens of thousands of young Israelis who are out fighting right now as we're having this interview, can I give them time and space to fight a little more? But even more important than that is to give a fillip, a bolster to the people who are supporting us, because they deserve it, because they're out there fighting as well. And there are students on American campuses and people in your field, in the media, who are fighting, and they deserve to have information. They deserve to have the best. Very good. So I don't have to speak for the government. I can only speak, you know, as a citizen, but give them an Israeli perspective that will help them to understand. Even the statistic that I gave you before, when you break down the 60,000, how actually it favors Israel. How many people actually know that? The 1-to-1 ratio. So to always hand that down. Now, why? You know, I've been in this field for a very long time. I was once a young man, and now I'm an older man, as we say at the end of the after meal prayer, right? And I would say the most frequently asked question I've heard over the last half century is, why is Israel's PR so bad? So it's not just since October 7th. It's not just this government. It's been every single Israeli government going back to roughly Golda Meir. And there are many reasons for this. Some of it has to do with a deep Zionist antipathy to what other people think. Ben Gurion used to say famously or infamously, it's not important what the non-Jews think, it's what the Jews do. And I can't tell you how hardwired that is into the Israeli psyche. Okay, I remember coming back from Washington about 10 years ago and telling Israeli security officials about BDS And they laughed at me. They laughed at me. They said, the major thing is that we be strong. We don't have to worry about BDS. We just have to have a lot of tanks and we'll be okay. Literally an Israeli response. There's also the response was very similar to yours, which no matter what we do is lost cause. Why bother? Why bother? Why would we take precious resources? We could buy another tank rather than spend it on our image abroad. And it is trying to convince Israeli leaders that the battlefield of public opinion is every bit, if not more important than the actual battlefield, that it is about time and space. It is about our duty to our people living abroad in the diaspora and to our supporters living abroad to bring them our truth. It's a very difficult case to make.
Let me ask you, let me turn the conversation to more contemporary issue. You mentioned, or other contemporary issues, you mentioned in an earlier answer that the government has made some serious mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Enumerate the gravest of them in your view.
So, I also do, I double time. I do Israeli media. I go on Israeli television, which is very different than American television. You go on, you've been on Meet the Press, and they'll say, my distinguished colleagues from the New York Times, I disagree with everything you say, but I respect what you write. And it's in Israel, on Israeli television, you idiot, you fascist, you moron. They're hitting you back and forth. And so I always have the thankless task of taking sort of a contrarian view. And earlier in this war, in November 2023, I got on Israeli television. And I said, we must absolutely flood Gaza with humanitarian aid. That the Palestinians in Gaza should be doing the backstroke in humanitarian aid and medical aid. We should set up medical centers throughout Gaza. Why? Because it was about time and space for the IDF. And everyone yelled at me, right, left, up and down, yelled at me because they're saying, listen, this is the only type of leverage we have for Hamas to give us, even let the Red Cross in to see the hostages. Who supports an enemy population during wartime? Certainly the United States didn't do that for Germany and Japan during World War II. It was unthinkable. And we know that 60-70% of the aid goes to Hamas. So why would we give aid to Gaza? It's going to go right to strengthening the people who are trying to kill us. So my position was very, very unpopular, very unpopular. And occasionally, and most recently last spring, Israel cut off aid entirely to Gaza. And you saw what happened. You saw how quickly Gaza was pitched into a situation. I don't know about the degree of starvation, but certainly severe food scarcity, and played right into the hands of Hamas. Because what the Israeli governments, this government and previous governments have systematically failed to understand, this goes immediately to your previous question, Brett, that the major battlefield for Hamas is not in Khan Yunis, it's not in Jabalia. The major field is on your television screen or on your computer screen. And so if we cut off aid, they can quickly take the pictures of 12 kids with pre-existing congenital illnesses and put them up as starving kids. And the world is just going to repeat that. And all of a sudden, we're going to be exposed to sanctions, immense pressure to agree to a ceasefire. A ceasefire means Hamas wins. It's brilliant. They do this every single time. In an article I recently wrote for the Free Press with Barry called the Wisdom of Yahya Sinwar. Okay, forgive me, the wisdom. And say he was a betting man. He made 3 bets. 2 were bad. He bet that Israel would remain divided after October 7th. He bet that the Arab and Muslim world would come to join in the Hamas attacks. But the 3rd bet, he hit the jackpot. And that is that he could, through pictures of, say, kids with cerebral palsy saying that they had starved, he could get the West to come down on Israel and force it to agree to a ceasefire. And Hamas would come out of the tunnels and declare victory. And so far, that bet has really, truly paid off. And that is the bet we must address.
Let me ask you another question, which is the question of diminishing returns in pursuing the military campaign in Gaza. And I hear a lot of very senior, tough-minded Israeli security officials saying, we have accomplished as much militarily as we possibly can. We will always have to fight, if not Hamas, some version of Hamas, whether it's Palestine Islamic Jihad or some version of militant Islamism in Gaza. We have a responsibility to redeem our hostages, as many as we can, while the living are still alive, while that's possible. The more we invest militarily in this war, the more we are going to suffer diminish our readiness as a fighting force, take our eye off of other threats. It's time to get a deal and end the war as soon as possible. And that may indeed be what happens in the next days or weeks ahead. What's your view of what Israel ought to do now with respect to the campaign in Gaza City?
Well, all of those arguments that you just cited are very compelling, and in many cases, the majority of Israelis would accept them. Depends how the question is actually posed. And yes, going into Gaza City will involve the deaths of Israeli soldiers, very likely the deaths of hostages, certainly more Palestinian deaths, and hence more pressure on Israel, more isolation, sanctions. And at the end of the day, what have we accomplished? We've got a wrecked city that that we may have to occupy indefinitely, and all that entails. That is a very compelling set of arguments. But there is a counter set of arguments which are at least as compelling, if not more so, which is this: Hamas is not going to give us back all the hostages. It's a myth. They are evil, but they are not stupid. And they know that the minute they give us back the last hostages, that is when the IDF goes in and destroys them. So they're always going to keep some of these hostages for, quote unquote, a rainy day. That's to begin with. Secondly, what does it mean to say, all right, the war is over? Hamas comes out of the tunnels. Hamas loves destruction. That is their identity. It's not as if we're hurting them by destroying Gaza. We're strengthening them by destroying Gaza. They're going to come up on top of that rubble, and they're going to go like this, Bret. And that's the picture they want. That's all they want. Once they have done that, then Israel will gain the reputation in the Middle East, the country that lost to those people in the bathrobe on top of the rubble. And guess what? No Arab country is ever going to join the Abraham Accords, because the countries that made peace with us, not because they love us, not because they get up in the morning and sing Hatikva. They make peace with us because we're strong, and we will be perceived as weak. And with ramifications certainly for the West Bank, for Judea and Samaria, what's going to happen with Hamas there, for our relationship even with our own Arab communities, who is going to move back to Nahal Oz and Nir Oz along that border with Hamas coming out of those tunnels and rearming and reasserting its control over Gaza? I mean, would you move with your family to that kibbutz in that case? I always ask that question to people. And these are very compelling arguments. And that to say that Israel can carry through this battle to the best of its choice. Yes, you can't destroy Hamas as an idea. You can't destroy Nazism as an idea. But the fact that there's no Nazi Germany behind neo-Nazis today makes a very big difference in the power of the neo-Nazis. And the same can be said of ISIS, and the same can be said of Al-Qaeda. And so, yes, we will be fighting. I always go back to the eulogy of Moshe Dayan gave for Roy Rothberg in 1956, where he says, we're always going to be here. If you should know, we're going to have a plow in one hand and a gun in another. We might as well get used to it. Well, get used to it. We're going to be like this. But while the other side plans its next attacks to us, Israel moves ahead. And we develop which is what by any international standard is one of the most successful nation states on this planet. And every once in a while, we just have to remind our neighbors that it's not a good idea to attack us. And if history can be adduced, then every once in a while, some of the people who attack us internalize that it is not a good idea, and they make peace with us. The Egyptians launched, 3 wars of national destructions against us, the Jordanians twice. Now we're talking to the Syrians, guess that. So, if history's any judge, the more we hold out, the more we fight, the more peace we get, not the less peace.
That's an almost compelling argument to me. I'm not exactly persuaded for the reasons you mentioned at the very beginning, which is that at some point Israel will have to occupy Gaza, and it will be a permanent drain on Israel's on Israeli manpower, on Israeli willpower, on much that makes Israel strong elsewhere.
Or not. Or we have an inter-Arab force or American force, and we don't know.
I've always actually been in favor of sending in Irish, Spanish, Norwegian and perhaps French peacekeepers, since they are so eager to recognize a Palestinian state. They should put their troops where their mouths are. You know, there is so much interest in this conversation that I'm going to open up a little bit earlier than usual to questions, because I see already 34 questions from the audience for our talk. So I'm going to begin. Let's see here. Okay. Here's a question from an anonymous attendee. With history full of massive forced population shifts as recently as the dissolution of the former USSR in World War II, why has Israel chosen not to be allowed to include Judea and Samaria and move the Palestinians out?
Well, the obvious answer to that is that the international community will no longer stand for it. And this is something that every time that Prime Minister Netanyahu would say to President Biden, well, you know, look what you did to Dresden and Hamburg during World War II. Biden's response was, well, that was then, and we've moved beyond that. And we have evolved since 1944 and 1945. That would be the politically correct, acceptable answer. The other answer is, of course, again, we are the Jewish state, and we cannot do what other states do. You have Chinese putting a million Uyghurs into concentration camps, and you don't see huge protests against them on American campuses now, do you? So obviously, we're judged by a different standard. The one difficulty in all of this is, yes, today we have Geneva Conventions and other conventions, international conventions that were enacted after World War II, and on the assumption that the human race would somehow advance from the barbarism of that great conflict. But the fact of the matter is the human race hasn't really advanced that much. We're the same people with a bunch of different documents that don't necessarily respond to the reality of human nature. And they certainly don't respond to the realities of Middle Eastern nature, where all of those documents were predicated on armies with dog tags and with uniforms fighting one another under flags. That is certainly not the case in the Middle East. And where the distinction between civilians and combatants completely breaks down, between children and adults break down, between women and men break down, as any Israeli soldier who has fought in Gaza or in Lebanon will tell you, and I have fought in both, and I will tell you. And beyond that, there's also a Middle East way of making war. And I'm going to say something that was very politically correct. I said it on a podcast some time ago. I got in trouble, so here I go get in trouble again. And it was this, that October 7th attacks were shocking, but they were not surprising. This is precisely the way people make war in the Middle East. It's what Assad's army did to his own people. It burnt them and raped them and beheaded them. It's what the sides in the Lebanese civil war did to one another. It's what the Syrians just did to the Druze. Exactly the same. And so Israel is being put in the place of not just being a Jewish state held by a different standard. We are a Western state fighting a Middle Eastern war with Western modes, which is keeping at least one hand, if not one and a half hands, tied behind our backs.
Bradley Smith has a question from, I think, the other side of the political aisle. How do you reconcile a world where Israel is a light to the nations, but the fact, in his opinion, that he is increasingly acting as an autocrat?
Who? Netanyahu?
Bibi, yes.
Listen, I worked with Netanyahu for many, many years. I don't think that the Netanyahu today is necessarily the one I knew during that period. It's now over 10 years ago. And Israel has a problem that we don't have term limits for our leaders, and certainly we should have them in the future. But there's a big mistake, and it's a huge mistake made in Washington and elsewhere, certainly in the media, calling this Bibi's war. And I'm going to shock you with my answer. Brace yourself. 95% of Israel's policy since October 7th under any other government would have been exactly the same. Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, exactly the same. Maybe they would have gone for the hostage deal last spring. I don't know. But I can't think of any move we have made that would not have been made, and probably made more emphatically and more violently, because Bibi has a very different reputation in this country than he has abroad. In this country, he's viewed as conflict averse and not as militaristic. Would have been made by any other Israeli government. These are Israeli policies, not Bibi's policies.
Another question asks for your advice, Michael, on how to deal with the American progressive left, particularly the Jewish American progressive left. Democrats are turning leftward, Republicans are turning rightward. Where does a progressive Jew go politically in the United States? And then this adds parenthetically, maybe move to Israel where the vote actually counts. What's your advice to
Yeah,
this
this is
left of
actually the
center?
hardest question I can get. This is a very painful question. I've devoted much of my life to maintaining bipartisan support in the United States, reaching out even to some very progressive members of Congress when I go to Washington. Until very recently, I'd like to defer this question to Richie Torres if I could. It's a painful period for me, painful people for many of my friends who have been really dedicated themselves to maintaining that bipartisan support. With progressive Jews, it's a whole different question. We have to ask ourselves who's in the tent and who's out of the tent. And I'm in favor of the widest possible tent, but even a tent has flaps. Even a tent has pegs. And what are the pegs? Where are the flaps? Flaps are, do you agree that Israel has a right to exist? Do you believe that the Jewish people are a people endowed with an inalienable right to self-determination in our homeland? Do you agree that Israel has a right to defend itself? If you answer in the affirmative to all of those questions, you're in the tent. The minute you say Israel has no right to exist, the Jewish people actually are the people. We're a religion and we have no national rights. And the minute you say that this entity, this Zionist entity, has no right to defend itself, you're out of the tent. And I really don't have much to talk to you about. But I know certainly as my term as ambassador and afterward, I'm going to appear on several college campuses in the coming months. I'm always going to try to reach out to progressive students who still would define themselves as Zionists. They could be profoundly critical of the Israeli government because these students are almost without exception on the way out of our tent, not on the way in. And this is the last chance we have to actually talk to them.
Rachel or Rachel Altura asks, do Israeli politicians and government officials realize the impact that far-right government officials like Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, etc., have on promoting anti-Israel propaganda? Wouldn't putting distance between their actions and statements help Israel?
I would venture to say that there are some members of the government who understand that, but perhaps not all, and not sufficiently. Insufficiently. They used to say famously, Kissinger said famously, but we're infamously about Israeli politics at all. Israel doesn't have foreign policy, only has domestic politics. Trust me, every country only has domestic politics. And I know from dealing extensively with the Biden administration that so much of the President Biden's policies toward this war were dictated and influenced by domestic politics. And so right now, Mr. Ben-Gvir, Mr. Smotrich are popular, certainly Ben-Gvir. And it's difficult to gainsay some of his even most extravagant statements about Israel's need to defend itself, Israel's need to go into Gaza and defeat Hamas. That speaks to a great number of Israelis. Not many of them wouldn't define themselves as right wing, and it's interesting.
Lauren Blatt wants to know, how serious is the recognition of a Palestinian state by France, the UK, and Canada?
It's very
Australia,
serious.
I should add.
It is a exceptionally anti-Palestinian move. The people who are going to pay the price for this, for these misguided policies, are the Palestinians. It was axiomatic. The minute that the prime ministers of Britain and Canada, the president of France, and the prime minister of Australia came out and said they were going to recognize a Palestinian state, Hamas immediately left the table. I wonder why that was. Left the negotiating table because they were getting everything they wanted. International recognition of a Palestinian state, which would someday become a Hamas state because Fatah is so unpopular. They got everything they want without giving anything up at the table. Why should they negotiate? They were doing very, very well. So as a result of these declarations, Palestinians will die. Israelis will die for certainly, but Palestinians will die. And there have already been 134 countries that have recognized this Palestinian state. It has not moved the Palestinians 1 millimeter closer to independence. It's actually set them back. It's a violation of the Palestinians' obligation under the Oslo Accords, by the way. The only benefit that the Palestinians may gain from this is Mahmoud Abbas, the perennial president of the Palestinian Authority, who in 2011 in the New York Times, you remember, Brett, he declared that he would now wage lawfare against the state of Israel. He was not going to do terror, but he engaged in terror, but he was going to have lawfare. and has since moved to try to sanction us and isolate us in international courts. This may at some point strengthen the Palestinian cases against us. So the danger here is strategic financial boycotts, sanctions, and isolation in the world.
Roger Gerber asks this. He says, in 2011, Israel released 1,027 terrorists, including Yahya Sinwar, for the freedom of Gilad Shalit, resulting in the death of thousands of Israelis and many Palestinian Arabs. In light of Israel's past experience, recognizing the anguish of the hostage families and the Jewish imperative to redeem captives, is it not suicidal and thus immoral to once again consider a release of many hundreds of terrorists for at most 10 hostages, knowing that many hundreds of Israelis will be killed by the released terrorists?
Emphatically yes, but tragically also no. And here I'm gonna quote an illustrious source, my kids. Okay, I have a daughter who has 3 kids who said, Abba, I don't care who wins the war. As far as I'm concerned, Israel's lost the war. We have one duty and one duty only, and that's to restore the hostages, to redeem them. Because if the hostages aren't returned, I will not be able to send my kids to the army. There's that covenant between the people of Israel and the state of Israel that says, you send your kids to the army, they fall captive. Israel will do its utmost, do everything to redeem them. Her brother, who also has 3 kids, a combat veteran who was wounded fighting Hamas, said, yeah, but if we don't destroy Hamas, you're not going to have an army to send your kids to. And guess what? They're both right. That argument is going on inside every single one of us all the time. Literally from October 7th to today, that is the argument that goes in between us. And the counter argument to what Mr. Gruber said is that yes, it's suicidal, and yes, if we let out 2,000 terrorists from our jails, 80% of them we know go right back to Hamas, and they're going to kill more Jews. That is insane. But in the next war, when we call up the 300 or 400,000 reservists, and some of them don't come, or many of them don't come, because we failed to redeem those hostages, then that failure then becomes a strategic failure, which is every bit as bad, if not worse, than releasing the 2,000 terrorists. And here's where you got to say a little prayer, Brett, a little bracha, that you are not in the shoes of the prime minister and the guy who has to make these calls. That's all I can say. It's brutal.
Sally N. asks, do you believe Trump is an asset or liability to Israel and the war?
Well, certainly right now he is very much an asset. Very much an asset. I don't know what another administration would have had the policy here. Just think back to what happened during the 12-day war with Iran. Trump standing up to international organizations who are trying to sanction us, providing us with a diplomatic Iron Dome. But we have to be realistic and cautious. I always say there are 2 Donald Trumps. There's the Witkoff Donald Trump and there's the Huckabee Donald Trump. Yeah. And you never know which one you're getting. And some days on a single day, you get both of them. Now, the Witkoff Donald Trump is the transactional Donald Trump, the Trump that's going to negotiate for a ceasefire. He's talking about one today in exchange for hostages, ending the war. There's the Huckabee Donald Trump that says we have to destroy Hamas to the very last terrorist and clear out Gaza and maybe make it a Mediterranean Riviera. And he says both at the same time. And we have to decide which Trump we're going to go with. It sometimes seems even the prime minister gets caught between these 2 sort of iterations of the president's view of this war. And it would be very helpful. It would be helpful for me as a citizen, to be helpful for you, if people who are looking at this, to know exactly what our policy goals are.
Matthew Schwaber wants to know this. If you could recommend 3 concrete measures to a future Israeli government to improve the country's perception in the U.S. over the next decade, particularly in the Democratic Party, what would you suggest?
As difficult as it is, we have to do something for the Palestinian issue. We can't ignore it. It doesn't mean creating a Palestinian state. I'm not a long-time opponent of the Palestinian state. I'm just a realist, and I know it's never going to happen. Just not. And I could spend an hour just telling you why it's not going to happen.
Or never as in never?
As in never and never. I'll give you the short version. There are tens of thousands of peoples in the world. There are Kurds and Druze and tens of thousands of people in the world who maybe have that right to self-determination, but very, very few of them are capable of sustaining a nation state. And it's one of the truly remarkable things about the Jews. You can take Jews from 70 different countries around the world. They don't have a common language. They don't have a common culture. You stick them in a country that has no natural resources, that is surrounded by enemies, and we're going to create this. As I said earlier, one of the most successful nation states on the planet. Because guess what? The Jews are a people. We're actually really a people. But how many peoples in the world are capable of doing that? Think about it. Very few. I cannot point to any evidence of the last 120 years that the Palestinians are capable of doing this. We gave them a nation state in 2005 in Gaza, and look how that turned out. It's got a government in Ramallah which is thoroughly corrupt and totally unpopular. Exactly who's going to run this Palestinian state, and who's going to keep it from imploding within 24 hours? So that's the small version of it. The fact that nobody wants it even in this country today or very few people is another thing. But there are ways that we can move forward. There are other ways. And the tragedy of the Steve J solution is that it blocks your thinking about other ways forward. And I actually know Democrats who know this. They won't talk about it openly yet, but there are ways you can deal with regional autonomy. You can have the cantonment system based on Switzerland, with a canton in Nablus and a canton in Hebron. There are ways you can think creatively and move forward. The idea is to create what they call a diplomatic horizon for the Palestinians. That's one. Secondly, create a ministry of information. I know that sounds vaguely Orwellian, but an actual ministry that has power, that has a big budget, and is able to coordinate messages. Right now, messages come out of Israel, talking points that are done by the army, which are completely different than messages of the foreign ministry, which are completely different messages of the prime minister's office, and certainly different than the messages given out by American Jewish organizations and pro-Israel organizations. There's no one coordinating any of this. So with a very big budget, particularly in social media, that could have an immediate impact. Lastly, I think, and most importantly, it's to bring people here. Everybody who comes here, I would say 96% of them come away with a different perspective. And there's no substitute for it. There's no substitute for actually living here, and you don't have to live in here this week and rush to a bomb shelter as the Houthi missiles try to come down on top of you, is seeing the reality of Israel and seeing that people live in this country. We are a country that loves life. I say that we're a society on shore leave. 5 minutes after a ceasefire, we're out on the beach and in the cafes, and we're not a people who wake up in the morning and think about nothing else than killing Palestinians' children. We are a normal country. Excuse me, this goes back to chosenness, Bret. We are a normal country cast into extraordinarily abnormal circumstances.
Jesse Cohen asks, how aware are the Israeli protesters demanding a ceasefire for return of the hostages, that inasmuch as Hamas is not going to release all the hostages unless their survival is guaranteed, it undermines the well-being of the hostages themselves and Israel's position globally?
That's a very, very hard question. It's a question I dealt to a very large degree with hostage families quietly. And many of them understood the impossible dilemma they faced. Should they keep quiet and say nothing? Or should they go out and protest and make noise, knowing that by doing so, they'd actually be raising the price of the ransom on the Hamas end? And some of them went with the silence, and they don't get a lot of headlines. There are several groups of hostage families that don't go out and protest. And others concluded that they had to go out and raise international awareness and put pressure on the government. I think the sad eventuality, which I think in certain ways was inevitable, early in the war, I saw that there were two camps. There was the anti-Bibi camp, which had been protesting for years, and certainly more emphatically in the period of the opposition to the government's judicial reform program. As many as 100,000 people out in the street. And then there was the hostage family movement, and slowly, like two planets, they began to converge. And so today, it's the same group, and you'll see posters calling for a ceasefire, but you'll also see demonstrators calling, comparing Netanyahu to Hitler or to narcotic narcos. Really, it's the same thing, which is, I think, it's very sad in a way. It was an inevitable evolution, and that enables the government more readily to dismiss it. They'll just say, well, they're just a bunch of people who are not going to vote for us anyway. Which is unfortunate, because there's the hostage family movement is a unspeakably beautiful, important, morally imperative movement, and that doesn't mean I agree with them in everything. I don't agree with anything. But to go to Hostage Square is to be moved in ways that you'd never imagined. And you've probably done this, Bret, and gone there and been part of that.
Final question, a bit of a reflection and getting back to the theme of chosenness. Has your optimism in the past 23 months receded or surged when it comes to thinking about the chosen state?
Definitely surged. And I'll explain why. Remember I told you that there's this impulse to go back to where our Talmudic forefathers were in late antiquity and during the Middle Ages, and saying that because we're suffering, because we're singled out, because we're oppressed, we are special. And I want to continue to reject that. That's the Zionist part of me. Okay, but I don't want to be normal. It's the last thing I want to do is be normal. And what we've witnessed in the world today, I grew up in a tough Sicilian neighborhood when I was the only Jew in the neighborhood, and I got beat up. And when I told other Jews about this later in my life, they said, "What? There's no anti-Semitism in America. You're making this up." Now, I think other people understood what I went through in my childhood, but more than that, the world has kind of reverted to what the world that our great-grandparents knew. I mentioned to a Harvard graduate the other day that Harvard's been around for about 390 years. Jews were welcomed at Harvard for about 40 of those 390 years. All right, so we're really the world's kind of reverting to form right now. A world that's very familiar to Jews, and our response, beside feeling sorry for ourselves and saying we were chosen, was to strengthen our identity. All right, we invested in the education of our children. We invested in the knowledge about who we were. And that was the source of our greatest strength, our greatest resilience. We're coming through this war. I mentioned it was an imperfect war in so many ways. There were grave mistakes made by this government. We are a country made of human beings. And even the people, even Benjamin Netanyahu is a human being who makes mistakes. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, we have still shown the world what it means to be a freedom and life-loving country that stands up and fights against evil. And that message maybe will be understood by future generations, maybe not. At the end of the day, the most important thing is that we understand it. And we fortify ourselves, not with tanks, but with knowledge, with appreciation and love of Jewish peoplehood, of Jewish tradition, and speaking very personally, of faith. Faith is very important to me. And that's my sense of optimism. I look at these young people coming out of Gaza, and I am in awe of them, God. There was a study done in Vietnam that said after 40 days of combat, the efficacy of a combat soldier goes down to 0. We're dealing with people who have been in 24/7 combat for 500, 600 days. What people on earth is like that? They will be the leaders of this country in the years to come, and there won't be anything like it on earth.
Michael, there are few people like you on earth.
Mm.
I really want to thank you for a wonderful conversation that ranged beyond the subject of your essay. I also want to urge our very patient and dedicated and engaged audience, pick up a copy or go to sapirjournal.org. We started this publication almost 5 years ago now with the idea of generating ideas for a thriving Jewish future. And that's what we've tried to do by bringing some of the most distinguished authors and minds from across a range of political ideas and religious backgrounds into a publication that we hope will change Jewish life for the better. And having someone like you, Michael, as a thinker and a historian and a writer of fiction, I should add, many things in our pages is a singular honor for us as we put this publication together. And we're also really honored by the kind of engaged audience that we have. Thank you for spending the hour with us.
Well, thank you all.
Thanks a million.
Shalom, shalom, Rav. Bye, bye, everyone. Bye, bye.